Hi there, Anne-Marie here, and today I will be showing you 3 ways to use your stencils with only one ink pad. We'll still have plenty of contrast and texture too in our final cards. I hope I haven't burnt y'all out on the stencils. I'm just having a lot of fun coming up with more ways to use them, so here we are. Today I'm using this Tim Holtz layering stencil number 148 named Ironworks. It's a really pretty kind of scroll work pattern. I have a few of these, but I hadn't used them at all yet. And I'm kind of a Tim Holtz newbie in a lot of ways. And I should have checked because I thought, just eyeballing it, that they would be fine for A2 sized cards, but they're not. They're about 3/4 of an inch shy of getting the width of an A2 card. So I had to get creative with continuing the pattern over the whole background. You're going to be smarter than me. You're either going to use a smaller panel or you're going to use a more appropriately sized stencil that will cover your entire background because it does make it more frustrating when you have to worry about that. Also, you're going to be smarter than me again, and you're going to make sure your ink pad is juicy. Mine wasn't, and I didn't have refresher or a re-inker for this color, but I really wanted this color, so I just kind of suffered through it. But it did add like another layer of frustration with kind of the patchy blending I was getting. At any rate, this is the 5th video so far in the series, which is going to bring us up to 15 different techniques for using your stencils. I will add a link to the playlist right here. Okay, let's get started. Today's techniques work with only one color of ink pad. There is one slight twist for the final panel, but we'll talk about that when we get there. I just wanted to challenge myself to work in monochrome this week after the mess of last week and all the disjointed cards at the end. I just wanted to streamline and simplify and just do something direct this week. For the first technique, we're going to lay down an overall layer of color. After I laid down the initial layer, I simply added the stencil and I inked again. So for the first layer, I was kind of light-handed. For this second layer through the stencil, I did my best to lay down a solid, saturated layer of color to really increase that contrast between the stencil and the background. And I loved the sort of peaceful unity this monochromatic technique gave to this very busy traveling pattern. So here is background 1. For our second technique, we're going to do something called ghosting or water stenciling. This is a really cool effect. However, it is delicate and somewhat subtle. First, I thoroughly inked my background. I laid it down pretty thick. Next, I applied a wet paper towel through the stencil. And I almost immediately went in with a dry paper towel to dry it as well so that the water didn't seep under the stencil and make this effect even less obvious. Every time I did that, I was lifting color from the paper in the shape of the stencil. I would recommend maybe using watercolor paper perhaps for this technique, or even just a heavier cardstock. I was using a lighter weight of cardstock, I think, and I noticed some damage to the panel after a couple of applications. So I think this effect could be really dramatic with dark shades of ink on a heavier weight paper that could withstand kind of more removal of color. It created a really cool secondary effect though, because some of the pigment separated. So the back of my panel ended up pink and the front became mostly blue with a little pink right around the edges of where the stencil had been. So bleed effects can add a whole other layer of mystery, really depending on what color and type of ink you use. For the final technique today, we're going to do what I've heard called a reverse gradient or a reciprocal gradient. I've heard those terms used in terms of nail art though, not so much in paper crafting. I'm not even positive it's the most accurate term, but it's how I learned it, and so it's what I'm going to call it. Basically, we're going to use one color, working from pure saturated color, fading out to white in this case. We're going to use it on the background. And then we're also going to use that same color, but now we're going to fade in reverse. So from white, fading to this blurple color that I'm using. It gives a really cool crossover effect. The pattern is still very obvious. The gradient is still very obvious, but the gradients and where they meet in the middle kind of all blend together, and it's just a trippy effect. It's kind of makes people do a double take. To achieve this before, I have used die cuts, and then I just had to ink my card panel in one color and then ink the die cuts the opposite direction, right? And just stop inking halfway on each. But using stencils required an additional step. In order to ensure that the bottom stencil pattern stays white while the background becomes purple, I will have to do an embossed resist. So we're going to apply the stencil, obviously first, and I inked purple through the top and faded out to the bottom. Then I pushed embossing ink through the bottom portion of the stencil, and then I covered that with white embossing powder and heat embossed it. So then after I've heat embossed, I can ink over the embossed portion to turn that background purple. And you might want to take a pass with a paper towel over the embossing just to make sure you're making it as white as possible. I did end up going back and heat embossing the top with clear just to make sure that the texture was similar with glossy embossing on top and bottom. And so there is the final background. Yours is going to look so much better because you're going to be patient with your embossing and not make a mess, dumping powder on your ink pad and your stencil and all over your desk. And you'll choose a stencil of the appropriate size with the juicy ink pad. It's going to be gorgeous. Okay, so then I took these 3 backgrounds and I turned them into cards, a background piece. And then I added a vellum mat to the 2 darker ones, mostly because I wanted to kind of camouflage the effect of the stencil not being big enough. So where it would join up was a little rough. And sometimes I had 2 join segments or 3 even. And so that vellum just kind of softened the whole look, but you still got a really good feeling for the pattern and the color. With the ghosted one, I did not use the vellum at all because it was just such a subtle effect. I didn't want to cover it. It just felt like it was just whitening it out. So I just opted to leave it off. Then I just topped each with a little wooden chipboard piece that I got at Dollar Tree eons ago, and attached a sentiment to that. And then I added a couple gems and we were done. And that wraps up our 5th installment of One Stencil 3 Ways. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate your time. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing or clicking the like button. I will see you next Monday with Cute Cards Quick number 7. In the meantime, I hope you have a scrappy, happy week. Bye.